Today's session, How to Think About Promoting Racial Equity, is presented by Dr. Robert Livingston. He is a social psychologist and leading expert on the science underlying bias and racism in organizations. Prior to joining the Kennedy School in 2015, he held positions as the assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, associate professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, and professor of organizational behavior at the University of Sussex, where he was also area chair and founder and faculty director of the Center for Leadership, Ethics, and Diversity. His research has been published in top-tier academic journals and has also been featured in popular press outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, BBC, Newsweek, USA Today, Time, and MSNBC. His Harvard Business Review article, How to Promote Racial Equity in the Workplace, was the winner of the 2020 Warren Bennis Prize, awarded to the best article on leadership published in HBR each year. His groundbreaking approach to combating racism is detailed in his new book, The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations, published in 2021. This book was selected as a Financial Times Best Book of 2021 and was also nominated for a 2022 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. In his spare time, he enjoys jazz, wine and whiskey tasting, gastronomy, philosophy, cinema, interior design, and nature documentaries. He has resided in 6 countries and speaks 4 languages. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Livingston. I'm going to hand it over to you for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caitlin, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm excited to be here with all of you virtually today to talk about some of my research. Let's go back. Here we go. So the title of my presentation is Promoting Racial Equity in the Workplace and Society, and it's based largely on my book, The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. And in the book, and also the HBR article that Caitlin just mentioned, I outline my PRESS model, which is a 5-step process towards achieving greater racial equity. The PRESS is an acronym that stands for P, problem awareness, R, root cause analysis, E, empathy or concern, S, strategy, and S, sacrifice. The very first step to solving any problem is being aware that, in fact, a problem exists. And that may sound pretty straightforward, but there are many situations in which individuals are not aware that a problem exists, either because they're in denial, because they don't want to know, or because they simply don't have the information. So, for example, an individual could be unaware that they have a severe illness like cancer. They simply don't know. And that would be a problem because that would prevent any sort of treatment from occurring. But sometimes people do know, they experience symptoms and they know something's wrong. The doctor's job is to then diagnose the patient to understand what is causing the symptoms. This is what I refer to as root cause analysis. And it's important not just for intellectual or academic reasons, but also for practical reasons, because understanding the underlying cause or the etiology of a condition will give you greater insight into how to cure it. So for example, headaches, severe headaches, if that's a symptom, can be caused by lots of different things. It could be caused by brain tumors. They could be caused by coronavirus. They could be caused by dehydration. They could be caused by stress and anxiety. And understanding the root cause of your particular headaches is really critical to designing the best course of treatment. So those 2 stages together I call condition, which are concerned with understanding the condition of the organism or the organization. The next step, which is necessary, is sort of assessing how much you care about the problem, how much you're willing to invest in the solution, how much motivation there is to do something about it. There's a famous movie called Leaving Las Vegas, starring Nicolas Cage, in which he plays an alcoholic who's aware that he's an alcoholic and he has an idea of where the problem comes from, so the root cause, but he doesn't care. The plot of the movie revolves around his decision to go to Las Vegas to literally drink himself to death. So he has embraced the problem, his alcoholism. He has absolutely no desire to enter rehab or to do anything to solve the problem. His message to friends and family is either join the party to celebrate my demise or get out of the way. So there's absolutely no concern. Similarly, there are people who may not have concern about climate change, either because they feel that they won't be around by the time disaster really strikes, or because they care about other things more, such as financial gain or profit. Similarly, there are individuals who may not care very much about racism, assuming that they understand that it exists and understands its underlying systemic and individual causes. They could simply not feel that it affects them, and so therefore they have no skin in the game. But assuming that people understand the problem and they're concerned enough to do something, the next question is, what can you do? So often when I work with organizations, that's the very first question they ask. They want to jump straight to strategy, straight to solutions, without doing the deep dive into the first three stages. What is the problem that we have here? What's causing it? And do we as an organization care enough to really want to do something about it? Strategy is often the most straightforward of these. And an example I always give is when I lived in England prior to moving back to the United States, I had lost a ton of weight because I didn't drive in England. So I walked everywhere. The portion sizes were smaller. When I moved back to the United States, I gained a considerable amount of weight, so gradually that I didn't realize it. And so there was low problem awareness until someone who hadn't seen me in 6 months pointed it out. And I stepped on the scale and said, "You're right. I've gained all this weight." Root cause analysis. Weight gain can be caused by lots of things, but in my case, it wasn't mysterious. It was the combination of eating too much, not moving enough. Did I care? I may not have cared if it were 3 or 4 pounds, but given that it was 30 or 40 pounds, I did care. Strategy. Do I know what to do to lose weight? There's no shortage of strategies that involve diets or exercise. If someone really wants to lose weight, there are lots of answers out there. But it comes down to this fifth thing, which is sacrifice, which is, are you actually willing to do what needs to be done in order to see the change that you say you want to see? And it's a function of how much you care, which is why there are arrows from empathy to sacrifice. So I'm going to go through each of these 5 stages now with data that sort of speaks to the issue of racism. So this is a study that was done by my colleagues about 10 years ago, Michael Norton and Sam Summers. It was one of the first studies to assess this in a systemic way. And what they were interested in were perceptions of racism from a large nationally representative random sample of Black and white people. And they asked them 2 very simple questions. They said, how much racism do you think there is against Black people in American society? And how much racism do you think there is against white people in American society? And they asked them to respond on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being none at all and 10 being as much as you could imagine. And so these are their findings. To make the study more interesting, they asked people to look back retrospectively at previous decades and report how much racism they thought there was. So let me draw your attention to 2 interesting aspects of the data. The first is that when you ask participants in the 21st century how much racism they thought there was in the 1950s, for example, there's a really high level of consensus between Black and white respondents. Both groups, both Blacks and whites, agree that there is a lot of racism against Blacks in the 1950s. On a scale from 1 to 10, the mean response is between a 9 and a 10. Similarly, both groups agree that there's almost no racism against whites in the 1950s. On a scale from 1 to 10, the mean response is between a 1 and a 2. So far, so good. But over the decades, we observe here a very precipitous decrease in the perception of racism against Black people, concurrent with a very steep increase in the perception of racism against white people, such that by the 2000s, those lines intersect. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that white people now believe that there's more racism against white people than there is against Black people in American society. I'll say that one more time. White people, and you can say white people because this is a nationally representative random sample. They didn't just choose one segment of the population. There are people from all age groups, people from 18 to 80, people from Kalamazoo, Kentucky, California, people who graduated with PhDs from Stanford, people who dropped out of high school, people of all genders, all walks of life, all backgrounds. White people now believe that there's more racism against white people than there is against Black people. Black people don't agree. They think there's less racism now than there was in the 1950s, as evidenced by the downward slope of the solid Black line. But they still believe that there's a lot more racism against Black people than there is against white people. So already we have a problem. So the next question is, well, does racism actually exist? And fortunately, in the social sciences, we have lots of clever methodologies to investigate the existence of bias in lots of different sectors and arenas, such as hiring in the workplace. So one of the most common methodologies used to assess bias in hiring is called an audit study. And this is a situation in which identical resumes are sent out to various different organizations with all of the information being the same except the race of the applicant. In this case, the race is indicated by the name. So they use Black sounding names, such as Lakeisha Washington, if it were a female, or Jamal Jackson, if it were a male, or Emily Walsh, if it were a white female, or Gregory Huffington, if it's a white male. And everything else on the resume was identical. The education, the institution, the grades, you name it. And so if there is no racism, if qualifications and callbacks and interviews are judged objectively, then Lakeisha and Emily should get the same number of callbacks for a job interview. If in fact there is discrimination against white people, as many white people believe, because they believe being Lakeisha gives you a twofer. One is you're qualified in this case because all the applications have exactly the same qualifications. And the second is that you are diverse. And so you enhance the company's diversity goals. So according to that hypothesis, Lakeisha should receive more job interviews than Emily. But if we're dealing with systemic racism against people of color, then Emily should be a more desirable job applicant than Lakeisha based simply on the color of her skin. And in fact, that's what the results found, is that the callback rate was not just 5% higher or 15% higher. It was a whopping 50% higher for white sounding names than Black sounding names. A study that took this a step farther, which is a study that was done here at the Kennedy School with the late Diva Pager, who was one of our colleagues here, looked at not only the race of the participant, but also whether they had a criminal record or not. So in addition to giving information that the person was Black or white, they were also given information about whether the person had committed a felony and spent over a year in jail, or whether the person had a clean criminal record and had never spent any time in jail and had never been convicted of any crime. So not surprisingly, the applicant that received the most callbacks was the white non-felon, who presumably has 0 strikes. And not surprisingly, the application or the applicants that received the fewest callbacks were the Black felon applications. But what's interesting is what happens in between. So if you had to choose one strike, would it be better to not have any felonies, but have dark skin? Or would it be better to be a convicted felon, but be white? Well, the results show that white non-felons are treated better on the job market Black non-felons are treated better on the job market than Black felons. They receive almost 3 times the number of callbacks, but as you can see here, Black felons receive fewer callbacks, Black non-felons receive fewer callbacks than white non-felons. And that's just a standard racism effect. But what's astounding here is that Black non-felons don't receive more callbacks than white felons. And if anything, the trend goes in the opposite direction. And so this is what we call white privilege in 4 bar graphs. And just to be sure, white privilege doesn't mean that if you're white, you're impervious to any sort of social disadvantage. As you can see here, if you're white and a felon, you're not treated the same as white non-felons. And similarly, if you're white and working class, you're not treated the same as someone who's white and wealthy. But at the same time, the data clearly shows that being white and a felon is not the same thing as being Black. So those are studies that one could argue are just cherry-picked. And so in fact, there was a meta-analysis done to see across an almost 30-year period, what do most of the studies show? And the data show that no, those studies are not, that the vast majority of the time, there is discrimination against people of color in these sorts of audit studies. And more than that, it doesn't seem to really be dissipating over time. People of color are aware of this. So this is a study that was done a few years ago by Sonia Kang and colleagues, in which they examined a phenomenon called whitening of resumes. So what they wanted to know is, if your name is Lakeisha A. Washington, for example, and your middle name is Ann, do you list your name on your resume as Lakeisha, or do you list your name as L. Ann Washington, thereby masking the fact to some extent that you're Black and thereby increasing your likelihood of an interview, because people of color sort of know that being a person of color disadvantages them on the job market. So to what extent do they whiten their resumes as a coping mechanism? And so the results show that about 33% of Black professionals and about 40% of Asian professionals admitted to whitening their resumes. So if your name was Lakeisha A. Washington, you listed your name as L. Ann Washington. If your name was Jan Lee, Xian Lee, Li, you may have listed your name as Susan Lee, Laee, anglicizing your name. If your name is Robert Livingston, for example, which is not ethnically identifiable, then you might omit membership in African-American student associations in college, for example. So again, they found that 33% of Black professionals and 40% of Asian professionals admitted to doing this. The next thing they wanted to investigate is whether whitening the resumes actually helped, or maybe it would hurt, as some people might hypothesize, especially for organizations that are looking for diversity. Because if you mask the fact that you're diverse and they're really looking for diversity, does that lessen your chance of getting a call back for an interview? So they sent whitened or unwhitened resumes to 1,600 different job openings. 800 of the jobs contained explicit pro-diversity language. In other words, they said, we're really enthusiastic about diversity. It's part of our core values. We're looking for it. Lakeisha, please apply for our job, to some extent. 800 of them didn't. They had language such as, we're looking for electrical engineers to fill a vacancy in our organization. So they didn't mention anything pro or anti. It was just pretty much a quote unquote neutral job ad. What the results showed is that if you whitened your resume, it almost doubled the likelihood of getting an interview if you were Asian. It increased the likelihood by 90%. If you were Black and you whitened your resume, it more than doubled the likelihood of getting a callback. It increased it by 150%. What was astounding about the study is that the magnitude of discrimination against unwhitened resumes was the same for the 800 companies that had explicit pro-diversity language as the 800 companies that had race neutral. So in other words, the companies who said that they were gung-ho about diversity were just as likely to discriminate against diverse candidates when they received their applications as the companies that didn't say anything about diversity at all. So, one thing that I want to argue is that racism is not really about individuals, it's more about systems. And one metaphor that I use to describe this is the salmon in the stream. So if you imagine, metaphorically speaking, that we're all fish and we live in a stream, the stream has certain dynamics. There is a current, and that current can be understood as racism. There's a current that pushes everything in a certain direction, downstream and out to sea. If you do nothing, the current will carry you out to sea. If you swim with the current, which is active racism, then you'll end up out to sea faster. But notice there's really no difference in the destination between the fish that do nothing and the fish that swim with the current. They both end up out to sea because the dynamics and structure of the environment will actually create movement in a certain direction. So anti-racism is actually becoming a salmon and swimming against the current so that you can make your way upstream to the pristine headwaters where you can spawn and produce positive outcomes for the whole species. So it's an active counteraction of the system rather than just inaction, which in many ways is complicity. So the next question is, knowing that racism exists, systemic racism exists against people of color, how much do people care about that? Research shows that there's three basic types of people. Dolphins, who are very much about community, they're invested in others, they're pro-justice. Sometimes they bump beaks, but they're basically friendly and cooperative. Then there are ostriches, who sort of bury their heads in the sand. They don't really care one way or the other about other people. They're not pro-justice, they're not anti-justice. Their question is, what's in it for me? And they just bury their heads in the sand otherwise and say, I don't really want to know what else is going on. Wake me up when it comes time to talk about the benefits to me personally. And then there are sharks that actually are attuned to other people. So they're not as apathetic and indifferent as dolphins. They actually are invested in keeping a hierarchy. They want there to be a food chain as long as they're the apex predator. So dolphins and sharks are both focused on other people, but for different reasons, whereas ostriches are indifferent. There's lots of ways that you can measure this, but one is with something called social value orientation. So people are brought into a laboratory, for example, and they're told you can choose between one of three different options. So this is one way that you can operationalize social value orientation. There are many, many ways that this can be measured, but one is choose between one of three different options. Option A, you get $500, for example, and option A, the other person gets $100. So you're told there's another person, maybe randomly chosen from the organization, who's on a different floor. The choice is anonymous. You get a packet of money, they get a packet of money, and they never know that you made the choice. So in option A, you get $500 and they get $100. Option B, you get $500 and they also get $500. In option C, you get $550 and they get $300. And the question is, which option would you prefer? A, B, or C? And imagine that there's real money on the table, right? Would you rather have it allocated in the way that it's allocated in option A, option B, or option C? And there's no mix and match option. Well, the point is that those choices correspond to different social value orientations. The individualist, or the ostrich, is the person who seeks to increase or maximize outcomes for the self, and they're largely indifferent to outcomes for other people. So in this case, it would be option C. Why? Because in option C, you get $50 more. And really all you're focused on is the top line because you're more focused on your bottom line. So all you know is that in option C, you get $50 more in your pocket and you don't really care how much money the other person gets. You're really sort of insensitive to the allocation of the other person. So they could get $3,000, they could get $300, they could get $3. What you're focused on is how much do I get, and you get the most in option C. So that's the option that you would prefer. The other option in red, the two options in red are called pro-self options. The second type of pro-self option is the competitor. Now, what differs between the individualist and the competitor is that the individualist is pro-self in an absolute sense, whereas the competitor is pro-self in a relative sense. So the competitor, or the shark, would choose option A. Why? Because option A maximizes the difference between what you get and what someone else gets. To the shark, there can be no winner unless there's also a loser. And they're actually willing to incur a hit to create a loser and to keep the other person poor, which I find fascinating. So people who choose option A are willing to forego the extra $50 just to keep the other person at 100. Again, you can't be Mount Everest unless there's a valley. If all the peaks are as tall, then you cease to be Everest. So they're essentially creating a valley here, and they're maximizing the difference between where they are and where the other person is. The pro-social option in blue, the dolphin option, are people who seek to increase the outcomes for the self and others in a relatively equitable manner. So these are people who expand the community pie. So in option B, $1,000 are given out relative to $600 in option A, or $850 in option C. And it's relatively equitably allocated. So 500 for me, 500 for you. Now, what's interesting again about the shark is they could have given the other person an extra $400 and it wouldn't have cost them anything, because there's so many discussions around this in terms of zero-sum game or scarcity of resources. And what if we had enough, then we could share with everyone? Well, no, there are some people who don't want to share with other people, even when there is enough. So in the social value orientation, the resources are not even the question here. It's not the issue, because even if they can allocate 400 to another person without it costing them a dime, they still won't do it. So the question now is, what percentage of people do you think fall into these three categories: individualist, competitor, and pro-social? I can tell you, when I give these options in a class, and I've done this dozens of times, anywhere between 90 and 98% of people say that they would choose option B, with the remaining people saying that they would choose option C. Occasionally, I'll get one or two people who say they'll choose option A. But in the real world, with real resources, real points, anonymous situations, the results look quite different according to meta-analyses that have been done. Only about half of the population is pro-social, slightly less than half, in fact, is pro-social. It's not 95%, it's closer to 46%. Another 38% are individualists, who are the ostriches, who would basically maximize self-interest. But what's interesting here is that 1 out of 8 individuals has the strong desire to keep other people from having resources. And again, they're willing to take a $50 hit to keep the other person poor. Now, lest you think these are just sort of innocuous choices that people make about how resources are allocated, think again, because research has shown that these choices in social value orientation tend to be correlated with more ideological variables that are more politically and socially relevant, such as authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, and attitudes towards immigrants. So the point here is that not everyone cares, and you can really put yourself at a social disadvantage if you walk into a situation thinking that 98% of the population are dolphins and that you merely have to raise their awareness and say, you know, not everyone's been treated fairly. And they'll say, oh my gosh, you know, I didn't know, let me change my behavior. Which brings me to the correction phase. And there are different strategies that work for different types of people. So for the case of dolphins, it's often the case, not always, but often the case that better angels appeals do work. That if you basically raise people's awareness that their behaviors are inconsistent with their values, that they often will change. There's research pointing to this, research on what's called hypocrisy induction. That shows that if you point out the discrepancy between people's values and people's actual behaviors, that they will bring their behaviors to be more in line with their values, because dolphins are intrinsically motivated to be pro-social and to be pro-justice and to be pro-equity. That's just part of who they are. Ostriches could take it or leave it. And so for them, you need a carrot. One such carrot might be the business case. So you would make the case to ostriches that diversity, equity, and inclusion actually increase productivity, performance, innovation, creativity, which could lead possibly to increases in performance and profit, which could lead to an increase in bonus. Now, once you start talking in those terms, now the ostrich is interested because they see something in it for them. Research has shown that sharks won't cooperate no matter what. So for them, you need a stick. You need strong sanctions to say, if you don't go along with the program, if you don't cooperate, you will be fired, or you will be fined, or you will be sued, or you will be put in jail, right? And that is what they will respond to, is avoiding a harsh penalty. They don't respond to carrots, and they don't respond to better angels. So what are some approaches to interventions that will correct or reduce bias? Well, there are individual level approaches that are gained or geared towards changing people's hearts and minds. There are cultural level approaches that are aimed at shifting social norms, which are informal rules about what is appropriate or inappropriate in a given situation, with the emphasis being on informal, because social norms are normally not formal laws or policies. They're more social prescriptions about how individuals should behave. And then finally, there are institutional level policies which change how laws, policies, practices, procedures operate within an organization. So to give you just one example, I've written a Harvard Kennedy School case on this. This is the Massport case, in which the organization Massport owns billions of dollars of land in Massachusetts, and they own a lot of parcels in the Seaport district. And one thing that they observed was that the people who were getting rich off of the developments, because they lease out the land for large scale commercial development, whether it's office buildings, whether it's hotels, whether it's a convention center and whatnot. And so there is an RFP, a request for proposals, and they realized that the same people were getting these again and again, and they were making lots of money, and there wasn't a lot of diversity. And prior to making the change in their policy, the proposals were evaluated on the basis of 3 criteria. One is, do you have the money? The second is, do you have the infrastructure? And the third is, do you have the right design? But they changed it and added a fourth criterion, which is diversity. And so now all of a sudden 25% of your score, because diversity was weighted the same as whether you have the money, whether you have the team, and whether you have the right design. So it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to get one of these lucrative contracts without doing something around diversity. Now, early on, developers were a little resistant to this because they were used to doing business as usual. And as many of them told me, Robert, we're not racist, we're just busy, meaning they want to get from point A to point B in the quickest time possible so that they can move on to the next project. And in doing that, they use the same subcontractors that they'd used for the last 30, 40, 50 years, who in most cases were white males. But what this change in policy made them do was do their research to see, are there any women or people of color who own architectural firms? Are there any people of color who own structural engineering firms? Are there any businesses in the community that we can give sort of discounted rent for commercial space in the building? They had to really think more deeply about how they could integrate diversity. And it saw huge changes in the representation of women and people of color in business at Massport. So then the question is, why would organizations be reluctant or hesitant to intervene? And what I've seen are a bunch of concerns, but the two main concerns are concerns about fairness, or this idea that promoting diversity essentially means discriminating against white people. So people often see pro-diversity as being anti-white and therefore unfair, and they're reluctant to adopt diversity policies for that reason. Other people think that diversity means sacrificing quality, that either you hire the diverse candidate or you hire the best candidate, quote unquote. So I'm going to look at each of those in turn. So I often ask people when they look at this scenario to tell me which one they think is more fair. And I don't tell them what fair is. I let them subjectively decide what they think is more fair. And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people will choose B. Well, B is equity. And there's a difference between equity and equality. Equality is treating everyone the same. So on the left, you have one person, one crate. Every single person is treated the same. Equity is treating people differently, but in a way that makes sense. When I was 8 years old, I remember going to my cousin's track meet, and I was in the bleachers, and right before the race, I saw something that looks like the graphic that you're looking at now. And I remember feeling outraged and protesting to my parents, my aunt and uncle, my other cousins who were there, saying, no, you've got to stop the race. There's been a mistake. Because my cousin was on the inside lane, and to me, in my 8-year-old mind, it looked like they had given everyone else a head start over my cousin. What I wanted was an equal start. I wanted the officials to bring everyone up back to the same point, line them up shoulder to shoulder, and then start the race. But what they had was an equitable start, right? Based on the geometry of circles, which as an 8-year-old, I didn't really understand that the person on the inside lane had a shorter distance to run than the person on the outside lane. So if they'd had an equal starting line, which was my fervent recommendation, then it would have created an unfair race. But many people see the world the way that I saw this track when I was 8 years old. They think that having a staggered start is lowering standards, for one, or creating an unfair race, or giving an undeserved head start, when really it's not. It's providing equity to a situation in which there is no equity due to the design, in this case, the shape of the track. And we know that society is sort of designed like a circular track, with certain people being relegated to the inside lanes and certain people being relegated to the outside lanes. So finally, the question is, will diversity mean sacrificing quality? If we go back to this example that I showed you here, then one could make the case that we're just propping up short people. If we use height as a proxy for competence or ability, then we could say, the little guy with the purple shirt is just not qualified to see over the fence. Just not qualified. So then why are we enabling an unqualified person by giving them extra crates? Fair enough. Another way to look at it is in this scenario, which is everyone is the same height. It's not a question of height or anything internal to the individual. It's a question of structures and things that are external to the individual. And here you have an unlevel ground, which we could use as a metaphor for privilege, and an unlevel fence, which we could call discrimination. And the only reason the blue person can see the game is not because they're taller than the red person who's standing on tippy toes, or the yellow person who only gets a glimpse through a hole in the fence. It's because they happen to be standing in a position of high privilege and low discrimination. It has nothing to do with height. So if that's the case, that sort of differential access to inclusion is caused by structural variables, then are we obligated morally, legally, professionally to correct for those inequities in the environment? And finally, being a Kentuckian myself and in the wake of the Kentucky Derby, I want to really question this notion of the best candidate. There is a best candidate, but you'll never know who it is because the best candidate is an outcome, not a trait. And so if you're running a job search and you want to know who the best candidate is, and there are 500 applicants, you would have to create 500 alternative universes. So this is a sci-fi experiment. Put each of the 500 applicants in that role in each of these 500 universes, press play, see what happens, and come back 5 minutes later and see who's performed the best. So it's kind of the symbolic equivalent of a horse race. So people often come to these horse races thinking they know who the best candidate is, because by the time a horse gets to the Kentucky Derby, there's nothing mysterious about them. They've been around. There's a lot of information. There's a huge CV on these horses. And people make bets. It's called gambling for a reason, because you don't really know who the best candidate is. You think you do, but you don't know until the first nose crosses the finish line. And as a case in point, this very year, Rich Strike, the horse that won, was an 80-1 odd against winning. No one knew that this horse was going to run despite all the data. And so all of our metrics are imperfect, and we actually don't know who the best candidate is until we look at the outcomes. And so anytime someone says we hire the best candidate, I sort of smile because I know that that's not even a verifiable statement, that you don't have any way of knowing whether you hired the best candidate. There's a second problem with this, which is even if you have a horse that wins the Kentucky Derby, that still doesn't mean that it's the best horse. Why? Because horses will come back and they will run two other races in what's called the Triple Crown. They will run the Preakness and they will run the Belmont Stakes. It's almost always the case, most of the time it's the case, that the horse that wins the Kentucky Derby is not the same horse that wins the other two races. Why? Because a lot of these horses are so closely matched, right, that there is no one standout best candidate. Every 100 years there's an unbeatable horse. Man of War, for example. Many streets in my city, Lexington, Kentucky, are named after this legendary horse that lived about 100 years ago. That was unbeatable. So, every 30, 40, 50 years, 100 years, you get a horse that's unbeatable. But in most years, these horses are pretty evenly matched. And which horse wins is the luck of the draw. That's a way to illustrate a concept that's called statistical banding. And what it argues is that strict rank ordering, so if you give a test to 100 people and you rank them from 1 to 100, people are tempted to say the best candidate is the one who scored number 1. But what statistical banding suggests is that there's no difference between the candidate who scored first, second, third, maybe fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh out of 100. Because if you gave the test again, the person who scored 6th on the first round might score 2nd the second round. The one who scored 3rd the first round might score 1st. The person who scored 1st might score 5th, etc. You're going to have a little bit of shifting around within a band. And so one way to capitalize on diversity without sacrificing quality is to have high thresholds and then treat everyone above the threshold the same, and then look for qualities that you think will enhance the organization. So I will stop there for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Livingston. So we're going to use the balance of our time until about the next 15 or so minutes to answer questions. So you can feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your question, and I will read them to Dr. Livingston. So the first question we have here is, regarding the press method and the perception shifts on racism that you shared, how do you engage white professionals to attend education like this when they don't believe there's really a problem? In many instances, getting white men to care enough to come to sessions like this would enhance their awareness of the problem has been a significant challenge, especially when the education is optional.
Yes, so it's a great question. And I think it depends on the reason underlying people's resistance. Sometimes people just don't know, which we can call ignorance. There's just a lack of information. And sometimes people don't want to know, which we call in science motivated cognition, which means that people have a high investment in remaining blind to truths that are inconvenient. And you sort of have to distinguish which one is going on, because there are different approaches to dealing with a lack of knowledge versus a lack of a desire to learn. So assuming it's just the case that people don't know, one of the easiest ways to open people's minds to other possibilities that could possibly contradict their own assumptions is through social relationships. And I talk about this a lot in my book, which is one of the reasons that the title is The Conversation. And I think it's important to sort of leverage social relationships. And so people that you know in your networks who are resistant are more likely to listen to you because there's a certain level of trust and there's relationships than they would be to say, listen to me, even though I'm an expert, because they don't know me. So I think sometimes people can leverage relationships to bring people to the table. Other times, I think it's the role or responsibility of the leader. So there are many organizations that require these kinds of programs or educational sessions as part of professional development, so that people actually, are exposed to information that they wouldn't ordinarily self-select into.
Thank you. And another related question, how does one make the education stick? We have a lot of courses, workshops, and talks at my organizations, but there are still white male colleagues whose mindsets have not changed. How do you tackle that?
Well, I mean, this is what my model is about. So, it's not just information. That's the first step. So problem awareness, then you become aware, and then what? Then you have to go deeper and you have to understand the systemic roots. And in this particular case of racism, I think there is no real understanding of the present without understanding history. Because if you don't understand history, then you have no idea how we got to where we are. And if that's the case, then you end up blaming people of color because you don't understand the systemic factors that have sort of created the world in which we live on purpose. So there is no accident, that there's a lot of deliberate thought that went into creating a society in a certain way. And then you have to do some soul searching and, sort of understand, how much do you care? There are people who, know that climate change is real, but they're not motivated to do anything because it's not their priority. They have other priorities. They want to be rich, or they want to be, famous, or they want to do other things, travel all around the world. So I think, each individual has to sort of look into their own heart and soul and ask themselves, why should I be doing this? That's a personal journey. And I think all of that has to happen before you get to any sort of remedy. But I think a lot of the hard work is in the beginning, is in those first 3 stages, and getting it to stick is getting people to really understand and build empathy. And understand that this is hurting people, and that in hurting other people, you hurt yourself in many ways. And there are a lot of books written about how, increasing justice in society will really improve the quality of life for everybody. So even if you're a self-interest kind of person, there's something in it for you. And I think helping people understand that may increase their motivation.
Thank you. The next question is regarding the social value orientation results. And the question is, does the data differ depending on the societal and cultural context? For example, cultures of collective nature versus individualistic nature.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a common question that I get. And I should have mentioned as I was zipping through it that this work has been done in many, many different countries. And the answer to the question is yes and no. The results vary a little bit, but not as much as you think. So it's not that in some cultures, 10% of people are sharks, and in some cultures, 90% of people are sharks. So, you don't get those wide variability ranges. It's only a few percentage points here and there. So basically the data that I showed you in that slide are pretty much generalizable to almost everywhere with subtle variations.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we deal with recruiters that say it is too hard to find Black candidates qualified for the positions? We've been hearing that very often.
Yeah, and I've been hearing it very often too. So I'll tell you a story about one organization that I worked with that was actually an oceanographic organization. And they had come to, and this organization was almost all white. And, one of the things that one of the individuals said to me is, we just can't find any people of color because there are no Black people studying migration patterns of the bluefin tuna. And at the time, it sounded good to me because I thought, I don't know anybody who studies migration patterns of the bluefin tuna. So maybe you're right. Maybe they're not out there. But after 5 minutes and doing some research, we discovered all kinds of organizations. So for example, there was an association of Black scuba divers that had thousands of members, and they actually would give out a marine biology scholarship every year. There was an HBCU, which stands for Historically Black College and University, on Chesapeake Bay, so it's on the water, called Hampton University. They have a marine biology program. Who knew? So the point is, many times when people say there are no X or Y, it just means that X or Y haven't come knocking on your door, and you haven't actually done the broad recruitment necessary to discover people. Because if you can find people of color in marine biology investigating, the migration patterns of the bluefin tuna, then I'm convinced you can find people of color doing anything. It's just a matter of whether you're willing to invest the effort and energy into looking for them. And often people don't. They post an ad and say, they just didn't apply. And there isn't enough of an effort to find them. The second thing that I'll say is there's not enough effort to build a pipeline. Because one thing is discovering a pipeline that you didn't know existed. The other thing is proactively building a pipeline. So this organization could have created a summer program, right? And may have created a summer program later to get people of color interested in studying the migration patterns of the bluefin tuna, which would then create a future pipeline. So I think there's two answers to the question. One is spending more effort to discover untapped pipelines, and the second is actually building a pipeline.
Thank you. The next question is, as an African-American woman that holds the DEI officer position, how can one get more buy-in from faculty? DEI is the DNA throughout the entire university. However, for example, we recently tried to incorporate a DEI statement for course syllabi, and we received pushback from a lot of faculty to make the statement optional.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that you can do in that. One is to sort of understand, and again, this is kind of doing a root cause analysis, to understand what the source of the resistance is. And what I found is that often for faculty, the source of the resistance is fear. And by fear, I mean, they don't think that they have the competence to really integrate this. I'm qualified to talk about race and gender, but someone who's maybe teaching, multivariate statistics may feel that they just don't have the capability or the competence to deal with issues or discussions around diversity when they crop up in the classroom. So I think that's one possibility. Another possibility, and I mentioned this in the talk, is that people often feel that DE&I quote unquote lowers the standards. And I have already gone through that and talked about why that's not the case. And also the fact that it doesn't undermine fairness. As well. But I think another approach that you can take is helping people understand the benefits of diversity, particularly in creative enterprises or intellectual enterprises. There's a lot of research on collective intelligence that shows that diversity of thought really does lead to more productive outcomes. It really does lead to a greater likelihood of finding solutions to really complex problems. So if you're an academic institution and you have homogeneity of thought, you're really shooting yourself in the foot with regard to your mission, because there is incontrovertible evidence that show in some of the books. I'll just give you a couple. One is called The Difference by Scott Page. One is called The Medici Effect by Franz Johansson. And Caitlin, I can send you a couple of references for some of this. But there's a lot of work out there that provides really, really strong evidence that having diversity within the organization is really beneficial to any sort of thinking enterprise where people work collaboratively on teams, that it increases collective intelligence. And so you could also present this case that you're really undermining the mission of the organization by having homogeneous individuals looking at things in similar ways rather than integrating more cultural and thought diversity.
Next question is, what would you say the responsibility of the media is in terms of creating awareness and moving away from the head in the sand misinformation paradigm?
Oof. If we had another 2 hours, I could really dig deep into that, because I think it depends in part on what you mean by the media and whether we're talking about social media, platforms like Facebook and Instagram, or whether you're talking about traditional media, Fox News versus CNN. But what I will say is, I think there needs to be a greater adherence to truth, and to the enterprise and process underlying the discovery of truth. And there are people who hypothesize that we're entering a post-truth phase in our society where the truth doesn't even matter anymore, which I think is one of the things that led to one of the multiple factors that is leading to the rise in hate crime, is the virulent spread of misinformation online, and so forth. And so I think there is a responsibility to both social media companies and to traditional media, and so, like a Fox News kind of thing, to not just pander to the desires of their viewers or their clients, because I think there is a push, for obvious reasons, profit, to show the people what they want to see. And there are algorithms set up to give people what they want to see rather than the truth, which, doing this work well, DE&I, requires a certain amount of discomfort. Because think about it, any sort of learning requires you to be in an uncomfortable situation, because you're in a situation where you don't really know what you're doing. So if you're a child that knows addition and subtraction, and all of a sudden you learn multiplication and division, you're going to feel uncomfortable, because it's like, oh my gosh, I wish we could go back to addition and subtraction. That was easy. This multiplication and division is hard. But if you don't push through that discomfort, you're never going to learn multiplication and division. So here at the Kennedy School, we like to think of the learning zone as being nestled between the comfort zone and the danger zone. You don't want to make people feel so threatened and traumatized that they shut down. That's the danger zone. But you don't want people to feel so comfortable that, they're not pushing themselves, because you never enter the learning zone. But I think media hasn't really taken people into the learning zone. It's really preoccupied with keeping people in the comfort zone. And that's a mistake, in my opinion. And I think that kind of undermines the transmission of truth, because truth often, at least sometimes, involves grappling with uncomfortable facts that contradict one's assumptions about the way the world works.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. So how do you deal with organizational refusal to consider diversified views because of pressing deadlines?
So, there's an old saying, you can do things quick or you can do things right. And, there are different organizations that have different approaches. If you want to do things quick, fine. Get everyone on the same page. Don't listen to diversified points of view. But as I've said before, if you want to do things right, if you want to increase the quality of decisions, if you want to increase creativity, then you have to make time, and you have to make space, and you have to have tolerance for diverse points of view. And that has to be baked in, meaning it has to be institutionalized into the practices of the organization, so that the burden doesn't fall on individual managers or people of color or people to sort of pull people along, rather than having a culture or stream, the current, that pushes people in that direction because it's part of the ecosystem. So I think, it depends on the core values of the organization, and not everyone cares about quality. Some people just want to get it done, even if it's sloppy. But if quality is important, then I think time has to be made for diversified points of view, and it's up to the leadership to decide who they are.
Thank you. So we're just about at our time. Dr. Livingston, I don't know if you want to say one closing thought, or we have a balance of about 2 minutes, but.
Yeah, one thing that I'll close in saying is, people have often described my perspective as optimistic, and I don't know if I would use that word. Brian Stevenson makes a distinction between optimism and hope, and I would say my perspective is very hopeful. I don't know that positive things will happen in the future, but I am convinced that positive things could happen in the future. In other words, I think racism is a solvable problem. Whether it will be solved or not remains to be seen, but I am absolutely convinced that it is a solvable problem, just as smoking is a solvable problem. Mortality is not a solvable problem. If someone says, I want to live forever for the next 2,000 years, I can't really help you. But if you say, I want to lose 10 pounds, it may be hard, but it is absolutely a solvable problem. And I put racism in that same category as weight loss or smoking, that it's difficult, it's hard. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not impossible. And so I want people to realize that, your job is not to boil the ocean, because that's an insurmountable sort of challenge. Your job is to boil the water in your pot or kettle and then dump it into the ocean. And with a community full of pot boilers all doing that, boiling the water in their kettles, in their pots, in their hot tubs, whatever it happens to be, that the ocean will rise, the temperatures will rise, the oceans will boil. We just have to work together and sort of be invested in this solution to the problem.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Very interesting and engaging. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. We hope that you will join us for any future webinars. And my colleague has just put a link in the chat for how you can subscribe to our mailing list. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all soon in a future presentation. Thanks.